Twilight turned her head back towards the doors, examining the next one open. The door closest to where she had just left it was boarded up, leaving the next door in the hallway open. The creaking floor punctuated through her every footstep as she approached the door. Twilight's ear twitched as she approached the door. She could hear something faint from behind the door, something that sounded like another pony. She quickly pressed her hoof against the doors and began to try and push it open, walking to a large open room. The walls were decorated with ornamental armors and weapons of varying different shapes and sizes. All the ones Twilight was able to recognize were only to be displayed and not used. Banners decorated with symbol of Equestria hung on the corners of the floor, and that was covered in red velvet carpet. On the opposite end of the room, it looked to be the statue of the pony, standing on its hind legs and made of bronze, holding its hooves worn down, rusted old sword with words on the wall written above it. The center of the ceiling appeared to be fresh blood stain that slowly dripped blood into a pool. The almost striking thing about the room, however, was that Twilight could hear soft sobs of a mare crying. She looked around the room, but couldn't see a single pony from anywhere where she would originate. "Hello?" Twilight called out, walking further into the room. She stopped for a moment when she had heard the medallion on her pendant begin to hiss quietly with its static sound. She stared at it for a moment, wondering if it would go quiet. When it didn't, she decided to ignore it for a moment and continued to try and contact the pony in distress. "Hello?" she called again. There was no response, and this just continuous sad sobbing. "Hello? Is anyone pony here?" Twilight cried out desperately to call out to the pony that seemed to be in distress. She called out for her several more times, but all she got was silence in return. "I don't get it. I can hear them. They can't hear me?" She wondered out loud to herself. She slowly began to walk over to the statue of every pony and examine it. It seemed to be a soldier, dressed and ready for battle, though she seemed to be missing its helmet. Twilight glanced up and looked at the wall with the writing. "Equestria, our First Nation, shall be defended in honor, for the peace of every citizen who wish to only have freedom and love, and will raise their shields and swords for them. We must be ready for the battle, our ideals to come to harm." Twilight pulled the helmet from her magic pool. She wasn't sure how this was going to get her a key to leave the house, but she knew that the riddle was telling her to do. She levitated the helmet down to the statue's head, and it fitting with a snug click. The statue suddenly moved, causing Twilight to step back in surprise. The four legs of the statue that were slightly holding on to the rusted old sword in its hooves lifted up slowly, before separating, let go of its grasp onto the blade. The blade then fell to the ground and landed with a small clatter. Twilight then looked up at the chipped blade curiously. The blade had a purple jewel just below the white bandage-wrapped handle, presumably to give it a better and less painful grip when it held in its mouth. The guard then took it, looked as if it was made of dark bone. She could clearly see the massive amounts of chips inside the steel blade, as if it's been through many battles and have left it unrepaired for years, rusting its way on its spot now. She levitated the blade up carefully to try and get a better look at it, and as she did, the medallion around her neck began to cry out a distorted, buzzing sound. The room suddenly shook as a gentle sobbing then turned into a loud, heart-wrenching scream. Twilight felt her skin jump as she quickly turned around. The room shook once more as a loud thud struck the room. She looked back and forth, trying to find the origin of the loud noise. Trying to find it, she heard another thud that shook the room. She heard a loud crack reverberate through it. She then turned her head up the ceiling lane and seen the specks of debris falling down as if something slammed into it. She bolted her attention to the door and tried to make a run for it, to escape the room. Another ear-piercing scream shrieked through the room as the last one thud shook the room, the ceiling bursting from the weight of the strike. knocking Twilight back as the debris and rubble hit the floor. Twilight coughed and gagged as the dust was billowing the floor, turning her attention to look at what had just crashed through the ceiling. A gigantic creature was hanging from the abyss of the building. Its legs appeared to be in the abyss, showing off into a large torso and head below. Its body was long and skin was rotted, marred with scars and wrapped in tightly bound chains. It was missing one of its forelegs. It was another bound, broken and mishapen. Under the chains, the head of the creature just brought the horror to Twilight. This creature was also missing its eyes, but more than that, the eyes looked as if they'd been put through a shredder and they were barely hanging on. Teeth were missing from its mouth and it was profusely bleeding from the skull, likely where it had repeatedly stuck to the ceiling to be free. The creature let out a distinctive mare-like screech that would pop Twilight's ears. She folded her ears down and backed away from the creature, her back hitting the wall. Her adrenaline instantly began to shot through her veins as she stared down at the creature. It writhed in agony at its bindings. It began to thrash back and forth in the room, the screeching and wailing of the horrific pain. Twilight could only stare, feeling her heart thundering against her chest at sight. She didn't know what it was. She didn't know what had happened to it, and the last time she ever encountered a creature like that tried to kill her. The creature stopped its thrashing for a moment, breathing heavily as it seemed to focus on Twilight. Twilight was freezing in fear, as if it was the creature that had noticed her thoughts and turned its attention to her. With another screech in its head, lunged straight at Twilight, mouth wide open to intent on biting down on her. Twilight barely managed to jump out of the way in time. The creature crashed into a wall. Twilight had been standing next to her. Twilight too slipped for a moment, but she got to her feet, instinctively levitating the sword in front of her defensively. She had never wielded a sword before, not even back during her days in Canterlot. The princess had asked her if she would be interested in any weapon training, but she had always focused on studying magic. Right now she wished she had done some training. The shrieking creature pulled its body back and shook with pain and anguish, crying out constantly. "Please stop!" Twilight yelled at the creature, watching it spasm under the chains. "I don't want to hurt you. If you'll just calm down, I can help you." She pleaded to the creature, trying to get it to listen to reason. The creature refused the offer, swinging its body straight for Twilight. She jumped out of the way once more, the creature smashing it onto the wall. Twilight tried to keep her balance, but the creature wasn't wasting its time this time. It pulled its back quickly and thrust itself forward towards more at Twilight. Twilight gasped in shock as she tried to dodge out of its way, holding the sword up to try and soften the blow. The creature's face grazed the side of the sword and it wailed in pain before striking the side of Twilight's body. She felt her body get knocked to the side as it smashed into the wall for once more. She groaned and felt the impact on her sides. She knew, however, that she didn't have time to wait and adjust to the new bruises. She scrambled to her feet as the creature began to pull back once more. That constant horrific yell was piercing straight for the cry of pain and agony that permitted the soul. "Stop, please! I don't want to hurt you!" Twilight cried out desperately to the creature, trying to get it to stop its assault. The creature roared out, its jaw crashing onto her body, letting out a horrified gasp in surprise as suddenly the room seemed to flip upside down. She could feel the powerful jaw of the creature beginning to dig into her flesh. She shrieked, crying out in agony as the teeth began to dig deeper, trying to devour her alive. The sword swung through the air, stabbing straight towards the creature's throat. The creature's jaw opened wide in agony, Twilight tumbling out of it as it began to flail across the room, crashing and smashing into walls all over the room. Twilight gasped and panted for air, rubbing the back of her neck as she stood up. The creature's wails filled her mind as she was able to spot the sword that she had been wielding embedded in its throat. Her horn quickly lifted her up with her magic grabbed the handle of it, ripping the sword quickly out of its throat. Its head slammed against the floor, shaking the whole room. Twilight's legs shook with it, trying to keep herself from standing stable, aiming the sword towards the creature once more. The creature didn't wait for another opportunity. It bellowed its wenching cry and rushed straight for Twilight, its mouth wide open for her to take down. Twilight didn't wait for it to get close. With a swift thrust of the blade soared through the air and stabbed the creature in the mouth. It didn't seem to falter to the creature as it seemed to take aim on Twilight down. Twilight then dodged out of its way, jaws reaching to where she had been standing and snapping shut on top of her blade. Her horn lit up, pouring a large amount of magic into the hold of the blade, and forced the blade out of its mouth, dragging blood in its teeth as it soared out. The creature's head rammed into the ground once more, as if trying to silence the pain as the blood began to spill and drench the room with its constant movements. Twilight held up the sword up over her, every nerve in her body firing once to react to attack, not letting have this thing take her out of this world. The creature cried out, its jaws smashing, wanting to devour Twilight. Twilight levitated the sword up, her eyes flashing white as she gritted her teeth, her nostrils flaring as turbulent wind picked up in the room. Debris began to be picked up. The splinters began to decorate the weapons and armor, beginning to circle with every cyclone of air. Twilight glared at the creature, at the sword being focused on her magical rage. The creature lunged for her, her mouth open and screaming. Twilight cried out in return, forcing all the air out of her lungs as she yelled like she never yelled before. The sword then dove down in the air, guided by the magical force. The blade struck the creature, striking the bottom of its jaw and straight through its skull, embedding itself onto the floor of the room. The creature writhed and shook, its body going into uncontrolled spasms. Twilight panted heavily as she watched the creature's agony spilling out before her. She waited as the creature began to shake less and less. Finally, the creature grew quiet and still. Her medallion became silent as well. Twilight panted as her magic began to calm. Her eyes stopped blazing white, and all she could feel was the effects of the adrenaline coursing through her veins, beginning to fade as the situation was no longer one of life and death. Her legs began to shake, no longer able to support her weight. She collapsed onto her knees and her mind began to reel, her breath not slowing as the horror of what she just did to crash in that full force. Twilight, are you okay? Spike cried out, finally able to get the door open, and came in rushing into the room only to stop. He could see everything. The dead creature impaled through the head on the floor, the blood that was splattered throughout the room, the horrible mess of destruction that had come from it crashing through the ceiling and destroying the walls and decorations. But most of all, he could see Twilight staring at him, shaking in place, with wide eyes. She was beginning to deal with what just happened. Her body was splattered with blood, some of it being her own. Twilight? Spike gasped, having difficulty in taking the sight for himself. He was rendered speechless. Spike? Twilight's voice quivered, shook as much as her body did. Her eyes began to shudder as much as her breath. I killed a living creature. The fear was evident in her voice. The pain began to grieve of what was done, striking her. Spike could only see tears that were quickly beginning to flow down then Twilight's cheeks. I killed it, she hiccuped again and gasped, her face contorted. She was trying to hold back her sobs, trying to hold back the pain and anguish, but there was no stopping it, and Spike could see it. He rushed over to Twilight and threw his arms around her neck. Twilight broke out loud, painful sobs into the small dragon's shoulder, her hooves holding him close as she could.